Summary of Regeneration by Pat Barker. Siegfried Sassoon, a decorated officer in the last few years of World War I, makes an anti-war statement that gets him sent to Craiglockhart War Hospital in Scotland, where Dr. Rivers, a psychiatrist, will decide if he is crazy or has war neurosis. When Rivers and Sassoon meet for the first time, they get along great. They are both amazed by how good and smart the other is. However, Rivers makes it clear that it is his job to treat Sassoon for the next 3 months and get him to go back to fighting. He says that he is a writer and that he is in touch with a number of well-known pacifists. Rivers also meets Robert Graves, who is Sassoon's superior officer and a close personal friend. Graves tells Rivers that Sassoon has had short but significant hallucinations in the past, but that he is an excellent commander and his men love him very much. One of Rivers's many patients is a young man named David Burns, who is so traumatized that he can't eat without throwing up right away. Rivers also sees an officer named Pryor who is very difficult to deal with because he has intermittent mutism, some memory loss, night terrors, and bad asthma that the enlistment board didn't notice. Pryor is often hostile toward Rivers and doesn't want to go to therapy because he doesn't want to deal with his feelings or think about the terrible events that led him to Craiglockhart. Rivers is annoyed by this, but he also knows that men have a hard time dealing with their feelings because they have been taught since childhood that being manly means being tough and not showing any emotion. Rivers thinks that his patients will be better soldiers and people in general if they are able to explore their feelings of fear and tenderness. This forces them to rethink what it means to be a man. Rivers also dreams of experiments he used to do at Cambridge with a friend and fellow researcher named Head. In these experiments, he purposely caused Head pain so they could see how quickly a severed nerve in Head's arm healed. Rivers says this memory reminds him of his own moral dilemma of taking his patients through painful memories to help them get their minds back to normal. Pryor is still hostile and doesn't like the way treatment works with a doctor and a patient. Rivers keeps seeing Pryor. Pryor says that he longs for Rivers to be a person instead of a strip of empathic wallpaper and that Rivers needs to understand that he too is repressed in his own ways. Meanwhile, Sassoon tells them in secret that he is gay while they are in therapy. Rivers is fine with this, but he suggests that Sassoon keep that part of his life as private as possible, since many people will want to do anything to discredit his protest, and Sassoon's illegal sexual orientation would be a great way for them to do that. Soon, the newspaper will print Sassoon's anti-war statement, which will bring attention to Craiglockhart. Pryor is locked up in sick bay for a while because he is having a severe asthma attack. Once he is freed, he starts to talk about some of his battle experiences and how silly war is, but he still can't remember the most traumatic event. Pryor meets Sarah, a woman who works in a weapons plant, while eating alone in an Edinburgh cafe. The two of them go on a date. At the same time, Owen, a fellow patient at Craiglockhart who is also a poet and a big fan of Sassoon's written work, becomes friendly with him. Sassoon suggests that they work on Owen's writing together. One late night, Pryor walks into Rivers's office, much less stubborn than normal and clearly depressed. He finally tells Rivers a lot about his nightmares that he had been keeping from her. Pryor agrees when Rivers offers to hypnotize him to help him remember the most painful event in his life. While he is in a trance, Pryor remembers cleaning a trench and putting the bodies of 2 of his soldiers who had just been killed by gunfire into a bag. Suddenly, he feels a single eyeball in his hand, which makes his mind break down and leaves him speechless. Pryor is shocked and angry that there wasn't more to the memory when he wakes up from sleep. On the other hand, he grabs Rivers by the arm and starts to headbutt him in the chest. Since Rivers is a guy, this is the closest he can get to asking for personal attention. Rivers and Sassoon keep meeting, and their friendship grows. However, Sassoon doesn't like the thought of his friends dying while he sits in Craiglockhart, safe and sound. What Sassoon wants to do to protest seems to be getting weaker. Sassoon's arguments and the pain he sees the war cause in his young patients, on the other hand, make Rivers question his support for the war. Sassoon and Owen's relationship also grows, and Owen clearly feels better about himself and gets better at writing poetry. Pryor goes to see Sarah again, and this time they go on a date to the beach and sleep together in a bush. When Pryor feels happy for the first time in years, he fights the urge to tell her about the horrible things he's seen, even though she is a civilian and doesn't know about them. Rivers, meanwhile, is showing signs of getting war neurosis from the stress of being in the hospital, so his boss gives him 3 weeks off. Sassoon has another hallucination the night before he leaves. He desperately wants to meet Rivers, but misses him and sees that the absence makes him feel like when his father left him when he was a child. Rivers spends most of his time off near London visiting his brother and Head. Head then gives Rivers a job as a psychologist for the Royal Flying Corps, which would let him go back to Cambridge and work with Head again. Rivers thinks about it, but isn't sure. Rivers sees his friend Burns in a small seaside village for the last few days of his leave. Burns was released from the army because of his mental health. Burns seems to be getting better, but during a bad storm, he has such a terrible breakdown that Rivers thinks that neither war nor service could possibly explain why Burns has been hurt so badly. The next day, Burns talks about war more freely than he ever has. River believes that Burns may one day be able to live a useful life, but never a normal one. When Rivers gets back to Craiglockhart, he meets up with Sassoon. Sassoon tells Rivers about the dreams and thinks they are a sign of his guilt for being safe while others fight, so he decides to go back to fighting even though Rivers doesn't want to. Graves tells Sassoon that a friend was recently arrested for being gay. Sassoon and Rivers then talk about how sad and hypocritical it is that society expects men to love each other as competitors, but not any deeper than that. But Rivers thinks that this intolerance is even more reason for Sassoon not to cause more trouble, because he doesn't want Sassoon to be singled out, shamed, or jailed. The exams for Sassoon and Pryor are on the same day, but Sassoon skips his, which makes Rivers very angry. The medical board checks out Pryor and decides that he can't serve because of his asthma. He is mad and unhappy, but also glad that he won't have to fight again. In their last moments together, he talks to Rivers lovingly and promises to stay in touch. Along with Pryor, Rivers also likes Pryor, even though Pryor has been annoying at times. Before Pryor leaves Craiglockhart, he sneaks into Sarah's room and they lie down together and tell each other they love each other. Pryor feels safe with Sarah during this time. Another goodbye for Sassoon and Owen, as Owen is also about to leave. However, Sassoon has to stay another month because he missed his test. Owen really cares about Sassoon, but he's afraid to show it. When they say goodbye, all they can do is give each other a pat on the shoulder. There is a job offer from Head, so Rivers accepts it and goes to London. He will have to return to Craiglockhart in a few weeks for Sassoon's second exam, though. When he sees Sassoon for the last time before going to London, Sassoon seems distant and sad because Rivers is leaving, and the pacifists are mad at Sassoon for going back to war. Rivers feels sad that Craiglockhart has put an end to Sassoon's protest in a way that the war could never have. Rivers meets Dr. Yealand, a doctor who also treats mental illnesses, at another hospital during his first few weeks in London. Yealand is bossy and authoritative, which is different from Rivers's caring and supportive approach to treatment. This is shown when Yealand cures a patient's mutism by torturing him with an electrode for hours until the man forces himself to speak again. Rivers doesn't do anything, but the picture stays with him for a long time, and he has a bad dream that he is forcing a horse's bit into Yealand's patient's mouth. After thinking about his dream, Rivers comes to the conclusion that his patient's crippling symptoms, such as mutism, stammering, amnesia, and so on, are an unconscious way for their minds to protest the war. By treating them and sending them back to combat, Rivers is putting an end to their protest, just like he did with Sassoon's. Rivers goes back to Craiglockhart to take part in Sassoon's test. They are both very relieved that Sassoon has been found fit for battle, even though he won't change his mind. As they say goodbye, Rivers thinks about how strange it is that Sassoon's personality and actions have completely changed how he feels about duty and war. They have made him believe that war is never worth the pain it causes, and any society that sends its young men to fight doesn't deserve their loyalty.
About the author. Barker was born in Thornaby-on-Tees, in the North Riding of Yorkshire, England, into a working-class family. Her father's name is unknown. Barker lived with her grandparents as a child. She stayed with them even after her mother got married and moved away. Even so, Barker earned a position at a well-regarded grammar school as a child and pursued her education. Barker finally went to the London School of Economics to study international history and got her degree in 1965. Around this time, Barker also began writing fiction, though she would later think of her early works as weak and childish tries. Barker met her future husband, Pat, in 1969. He was an academic 20 years older than her, and he left his wife to marry her instead. They weren't formally married for another 10 years, after having 2 children together. Barker's first critically acclaimed book, Union Street, came out in the early 1970s. It was a collection of 7 women's stories that were all linked by poverty and domestic violence. But it took her 10 years of hard work to get it released because most publishing houses thought it was too dark for a general audience. But when another female author told her about the feminist publishing house Virago, the novel became a critical hit in 1982 and is still the best-selling book from that company. In the 1990s, Barker wrote the Regeneration trilogy, which began with Regeneration in 1991 and was about men and manhood during wartime. She was often called a feminist author at the time. The reviews for this series were also good, and one of the books won the prestigious Man Booker Prize, and another was shortlisted for it.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.